Hi, my name is Higgins-Desbiolles. I'm a tourism academic with the University of South Australia, teaching in tourism management. And I was asked by your lecturer to speak to you today about tourism and hospitality and some of the thinking that I've been doing in the space of changing tourism, rethinking tourism. So today I'm talking to you about thinking of the host, in parentheses, in tourism and hospitality. And so an overview of what I'd like to do with you in these few moments we have together is I'd like to go to a philosopher I'm sure you're familiar with, Jacques Derrida, and talk about his thinking about hosting, guest, and hospitality. And after that, I'll talk about redefining tourism by the local community, the host community, and why that may be important. That then moves us into this conversation about socializing tourism. And then I'll bring to your attention some changing practices in tourism that we can look to, perhaps as forms of socializing tourism and making the changes needed. So in turning to Jacques Derrida and his thinking on hospitality, he discussed the impossible idea of a law of unlimited hospitality, and then that contrasts with the laws of hospitality of what's possible. The first is unconditional, while the latter is conditional, and it's based upon the behavior, the rights, and the laws applying to guest and host, and what the host has to offer the guest in offering hospitality. A historian, philosopher in tourism, Kevin O'Gorman, has pointed out in his study of Derrida's work on thinking about the meaning of hospitality and the relations between host and guest in tourism. He notes that the roots of the words go back to stranger, guest, and power. So in moving beyond the idea of unconditional hospitality, we begin to get to questions of what can the guest demand of the host? What does the host owe the guest? And what are the rules guiding those behaviors? Derrida recognized tensions in hospitality, and he said that offering hospitality always holds the possibility of hostility, and he created the word hospitality, a very awkward word, to come to grips with that. Because the host is seeking to retain mastery and control over his or her domain in which they host the guest. And O'Gorman moves into ideas of mobilities, hosting strangers, and then thinking about tourists as guest versus refugees as guest, and who do we see us owing hospitality to in these modern times. So in thinking about this, I really think that we could rethink the ways that we know tourism in light of some of the problems that tourism has recently encountered, to rethink tourism. And so in 2019, I wrote about rethinking tourism, and here I had been teaching for a number of years a course on tourism policy and planning, and I had started, as many lecturers do, with the definitions. So we define tourism, the various ways tourism is known, and it often features a model of putting in connection the tourist motivations for touring and receiving tourism services, the nature of their demand, and then that being met by tourism businesses, what we call the tourism industry, in providing products and services to the tourist, creating tourism experiences for them to enjoy on their holidays. But what always made me uncomfortable about this was, where was the local community? In tourism, tourism always occurs in a place, and generally there's a local community that lives in that place. And yet, if we use the concepts of host and guest and hospitality, we might see with the conventional definition of tourism that it's the tourism businesses, the tourism service providers who are the host of the tourist. And, they're the people running the accommodations, the attractions, the adventures that tourists go upon. But we conventionally in tourism call the local community the host community. So that raises questions about, why do the local communities not have a presence in our definition of tourism? If they're mentioned, they're often just one among many stakeholders and not the most important stakeholder among the many that are there. So I would say by this approach, the host or the local community are almost made invisible. And I believe that this is a source of some of the problems, and it's a catalyst to the tensions that we find that happens in current tourism, which I'll speak about in a moment. And the host rights and needs are treated as less important, as secondary to the issue. And I think that's a source of the problem. In fact, if we look at experiences in some of the major European cities before COVID-19, experiencing over-tourism, we might see very clear instances of Derrida's hospitality in action, as host, for instance, in Barcelona, became very angry about tourists crowding them, the cruise ships dropping off 3,500 people to go to very limited tour itineraries in Barcelona and crowding out the local people. And the same in Venice. So this gets us thinking about the nature of the phenomenon and then how we define it. How we define it might then situate how we manage it. So what I proposed in this work on rethinking tourism is defining tourism by the local community and placing them at the center of our concerns with tourism. And this model that's on the screen for you shows you some of the outcomes of this thinking, that if we define tourism as the act of local communities receiving, hosting visitors, tourists, in their communities for a limited amount of time, with the intention to gain benefits from that in recognition of their rights and needs, then we reorient the phenomenon altogether. And so if we look at the other major players in tourism, then we'd see that the tourism businesses no longer are seen as the host of the tourist. They need a social contract with a local community, a social license to operate, to run the services and give the products to the tourists that they give. So it's a negotiated right of access to the local community. The tourist, instead of being a demanding consumer, emphasizing their rights, becomes a guest. And then we think about hospitality and hosting, perhaps through Derrida's rich and detailed lens of what it means to be a guest and what are the conditions under which one is received as a guest in someone's home, which is what the local community is. They're in their home. Governments then would need to involve local communities at the center of tourism decision-making and take their rights, interests, and needs into a clear account in the decisions that occur. And then lastly, the destination marketing organizations. So I'm thinking about, for instance, the tourism commissions, Tourism Queensland, the South Australian Tourism Commission, Tourism Tasmania, and so on. These need to shift back to what they once were, which was a public servant operation. Rather than just marketers and public relations people, they need to shift their mindset back to serving communities' needs and interest in tourism with an emphasis upon the public good, because they are paid by the taxpayer and they are in the government domain. So public good should be what is operational in their mindsets. So if we take this framework that's been offered, we could rethink tourism altogether and perhaps address some of the difficulties that come with tourism. And then I took this thinking one step further, and I'd like to share that with you. And it's the idea of socializing tourism. And this has been written about in an article and expanded upon in an edited book. And it's the idea to socialize tourism, to make tourism responsive and answerable to the society in which it occurs, meaning that local community. It involves putting tourism in its proper place. That's at the service of local communities, meeting their needs and interests rather than imposing upon them. So this socializing tourism expands upon this idea of redefining tourism by the local community. And then we might ask, why is this rethinking needed? Well, tourism has been, before the pandemic, profoundly unsociable. We know about disrespectful behavior. Here in the Asia Pacific region, there's been this phenomenon, which I think comes off of social media and Instagram, and that ability to be an Instagram influencer, where people do things that are disrespectful, inappropriate in a religious setting or a sacred setting or a natural setting, and even illegal in the places. And yet they film themselves doing it to get that social media presence that they're seeking. So for instance, I think it was a group of 5 tourists were arrested for getting undressed and taking a photo of themselves at one of the sacred mountains there. Higgins-Desbiolles, I think, is the name of the mountain. It happened here in Australia with a French exotic dancer dancing naked on top of Uluru before the climb closed. That's another example. And the traditional owners found it very disrespectful of Uluru in Central Australia. There are particular forms of tourism that might be called particularly unsocial, and the obvious one to designate here is phenomenon like sex tourism and child sex tourism, which are perhaps some of the more exploitative, easily criticized niches of tourism. And we might add to that more considered discussions of things like slum tourism, the poverty gaze of tourists, orphanage tourism, and it's been shown to be a catalyst to children being taken away from families and put in orphanages because of the attraction and the lure of the tourist dollars. So there's many types of tourism that become problematic and exploitative. There are also particular tourism effects that we could look to and say these dynamics are unsocial and damaging, particularly to local communities. Tourism causes dispossession. Land is taken away to create developments, to create golf courses, to create theme parks. Indigenous peoples are dispossessed, and particularly at the moment in Tanzania, the Maasai are being removed from near Kilimanjaro, and there's protest about that, so you can look that up. Tourism typically does have an element of dispossession of groups of people. And one dynamic, for instance, is the removal of fisher people from the beaches, because the fisher people who bring up the nets that bring up the fish next to resorts that host tourists bring fishy smells and, unhygienic situations, and the tourists complain about that. So then we get gated resorts creating dispossession, for instance, from that enterprise at the beach, fishing. There are poor jobs in tourism, and tourism was shown by the COVID-19 pandemic, tourism and hospitality, both of them, to have poor pay and precarity within them. And that's why we're seeing, after we get toward the end of the pandemic, that people aren't taking up those jobs because they found that there are more well-paid, more stable options to turn to. And then another issue the pandemic has exposed is the dangers of being dependent upon tourism for your economy. So some places are, quite dependent upon tourism. We could think about Bali, the Maldives, places where the percentage of the gross domestic product has a big contribution from tourism. When COVID saw the shutdowns and tourism closed down temporarily to try to stop the spread of the pandemic, that tourism dependency became exposed. So in Bali, there was writing saying that people that were working in the south of the island, where the resorts, many of the developments are, with the pandemic, went back to their home villages in the north of the island and returned to subsistence living. And that the elders in their communities and their families were happy to see them come home, and that some of the subsistence traditional activities were picked up again. The same has been recorded in the Pacific Islands in the research of Api Mavono and Regina Shavens, for instance, in Fiji, a very similar phenomenon. Then in tourism, another aspect of being unsocial is structural injustices. Now, when I say this word, we're getting to the deeper layers of how governance works, powers work, moving to the macro level of power and its importance in tourism. And we think about how that works to the disadvantage of local communities. So for instance, when we think about problems happening in places like Mallorca and Barcelona, cheap package tours, and with the global trade regime favoring the big multinationals in tourism, this saw cheap trips being available from people from Northern Europe at really ridiculous prices. And party tourists could go fly into these places for a weekend of, enjoying stag parties and, craziness, mayhem, within a community where people are living and trying to work and trying to raise families. And that's been some of the tensions around what's been happening, for instance, with Airbnb, going into the heart of communities rather than in hotels in tourist zones. And then that connects us up with this phenomenon of over-tourism, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It is the case when tourism exceeds the social capacities of a place, and the residents and the tourists suffer as a result of the difficulties, tensions, physical degradation to the environment that occurs. And so we've seen over-tourism being discussed in these European cities I've been talking about, including Venice and Barcelona, but also Dubrovnik and Reykjavik. The cruise ships come into this, Amsterdam, but also here in Australia with Byron Bay, for instance, and even smaller towns. Eden in New South Wales has had some tensions around tourism being imposed upon it. So it's all around the world that we see these tensions of over-tourism happening. And this could be seen as an aspect of tourism being unsocial in its impacts. So what might we look at to talk about what socializing tourism might look like? Well, this I could talk to you for days about, but I won't. I'll only give you a few examples to start you thinking and invite you to do some reading, particularly the book Socializing Tourism, Rethinking Tourism for Social and Ecological Justice might be worth looking into with the chapters that make up that book. But for instance, there is a phenomenon in Hawaii, and Hawaii is an interesting place because tourism has been imposed upon an indigenous people, and that indigenous people, the native Hawaiians, the Kanaka Maoli, have been under an illegal occupation by the US. And I don't know if you know about that. You can read about it and see what I'm talking about. But this beautiful edited book was released by two academics living in Hawaii, and one being Native Hawaiian, gathered chapters from artists, from historians, from activists, a variety of people, and talking about detours, which is short for decolonial tours. And this emphasizes the rights of local communities as custodians of place. On page 12 of the book, there's something that says, this is an alternative travel guide to know Hawaii in a way that the tourist won't. And it says, everyone must follow the understood protocols of each place and request permission to enter before passing through. You can ask for permission, but that doesn't mean that permission will be given. And some places are not available to all that ask. So in detours, there are some stories about Native Hawaiians reviving old practices that are meant for Native Hawaiians to reconnect to start to practice again, and to start sharing with future generations. And we only get a glimpse into that in this book. But there are things that you can learn, for instance, about the occupation of Pearl Harbor and Waikiki and detours that are led there, telling about the old histories and then what's been layered over that with military occupation by the American forces. Detours talks about the permission to enter a well-loved place being conditional. And again, that goes back to what we were saying about Derrida's thinking, that there's really conditions on hospitality, that it's only idealistic utopian to think that hospitality is unconditional. So in terms of detours, it says it demands an openness to what the encounters have to teach, a deference to the depth and authority of local knowledge, and a willingness to be changed by the journey itself. So rather than being easy holidays of sitting on a beach and not thinking, these detours ask you to be engaged in a learning journey and to change in that process through that journey. They call it a huakai, which is an organized walk of learning together. Now that to me looks like a really great example of socializing the guest, socializing the host, because in a way too, these detours, this travel guide talks to Native Hawaiians of various classes and kinds and abilities in this book. And then it talks to resident non-Hawaiians in Hawaii. And then thirdly, it talks to these visitors. So it's this idea of socializing people to a place that they haven't understood it fully in all its richness. And these journeys can be explorations of that. The other thing that I think is a good example of socializing tourism is the recent phenomenon of tourism pledges. And this is when the governments or the tourism destination management organizations or the local communities create pledges that ask tourists to sign up and promise to be good visitors during their time of being hosted in a community. The case of Palau in the Northern Pacific is a great one. It was the children that wrote the pledge, and you see that on the right-hand side of the screen. Maybe I need to move my image a little bit. Sorry, go back again. You can look this up. I'm afraid my image might be blocking it, but the children wrote what they want the guests to sign up to. And it includes what you'd think is a responsible tourism code: to travel carefully, mindfully, and respectfully, to not take things, to not do harm. And the only thing that you leave are your footprints. And then the tourist signs this, and this is stamped in their passport when they visit. And there's a webpage to educate people about this. The little letter is an example of what's posted on the website from a child explaining how the children feel about visitors and what they want them to appreciate. So this is the community setting up what the principles of visitation are, saying, yes, we will receive you as tourists, but we want you to respect our culture, our people, and our place when you come to visit. Another great example that you can read about is in Byron Bay, where the youth of Byron Bay have written a visitor's pledge together collegially in dialogue with Indigenous custodians, Aboriginal custodians of place, as well as tourism providers, but particularly the leadership of the youth. And it's called the Byron Way Pledge, and it's a really unique pledge that you can look at as well. I'd recommend that one. So what these pledges are doing is socializing the tourists to say, we will receive you as tourists if you agree to respect our traditions, our people, our youth, and then you benefit our place. You know, we give, but you also need to give back to us. So where does this lead us? I think socializing tourism brings us to this idea of thinking about tourism for the public good. And there are various categories of what this might be. For instance, one that's been practiced for a very long time is social tourism. And so you can look up what this means. It's tourism for all, and it tries to enable people to have the blocks that would prevent them from tourism removed. And that gets supported by governments and by non-governmental organizations. There's accessible tourism when we think about inclusion of people with many different abilities. It might be physical disabilities, mobility difficulties, intellectual disabilities, health disabilities, many different ideas. And then that's the role of, for instance, agencies like the tourism commissions to ensure that they're supporting accessible tourism. South Australia has recently released an accessible tourism strategy. Solidarity tourism is another form, and Dolnikar and McCabe have written about this recently in the Annals of Tourism Research, and it's the idea of using your tourism to support communities in need, maybe in conflict, and using your tourist spending and abilities to help them address the difficulties that they're in. There's citizen science and citizen social science, which creates public good outcomes from tourists. So that might be Earthwatch volunteer tours where tourists pay for holidays working with climate scientists or ecological scientists on protection and conservation projects. We have these in Australia. I know of one on Kangaroo Island where they've previously worked on echidna conservation and habitat and health. And then we have specific examples that I'll invite you to look up. I won't speak about them in any detail, but these are examples of tourism helping build community and work toward helping those that might be suffering disadvantages or creating multiple public good outcomes. So migrant tours in Europe is one that's been written about in the tourism literature. Fairbnb is an alternative to Airbnb, and it's a cooperative operating in Europe. Global Exchange is a human rights organization that uses tours to teach about human rights around the world. And then SESC Brazil is a great one in social tourism that you can look at. This has been operating, I think, since the 1940s. It might even be earlier. And it has social tourism resorts, social tourism facilities that workers and poor and homeless can use to enjoy holidays, to have a break, and also to get leisure and education. For instance, they'll have public libraries in big cities like Sao Paulo and recreation facilities for the underprivileged in their communities. So these are some good examples of tourism and hospitality for the public good. So I've given you a taste of some of my work. We've done, a quick run through of some of these ideas. And so in conclusion, what I'd say is we have to recognize that many countries and communities engage with tourism for the benefits, for the economic benefits it offers. And so we think about foreign exchange, we think about the jobs, the income, opportunities like that. But we need to not forget that tourism remains an important social force. And this is what I wrote about early in my work in 2006. It is a social force because tourism brings people together in the tourism encounter. So it's social in that aspect. And it's particularly social about the encounter between host and guest. Too often, though, this encounter has power and exploitation in it. So the community framework, the community-centered framework that I've proposed that came on an earlier slide, proposes that we prioritize local communities where tourism occurs as a solution to some of the problems in tourism. And then socializing tourism works to support one process to frame how Derrida's thoughts on laws of hospitality might be acted upon, better designating who is host and what is owed from guests to the host when they come to visit in their local communities. And it's with an idea for the well-being of the local people and the local ecology from their visitation. I hope that this has been helpful in your learning and in your thinking. I wish I could be with you in person, but COVID remains with us. Stay well, and I'll hope your studies go well, and I wish you really good success. For my references, you have them here on the slide, and I'll share my PowerPoint with your lecturer. Thank you for listening to me. Bye.